Jackson Reeves stood behind the weathered oak bar of the corner pocket, methodically wiping down glasses as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the front windows. The bar had been his dream for 15 years, and even on quiet days like this, he couldn't help but smile at what he'd built. His eyes drifted to the vibrant paintings adorning the walls, Isabel's work, each piece carefully chosen to tell their story together. The newest edition, a striking canvas of deep blues and golds, depicted the night they first met. He remembered it clearly, Isabel walking in during a thunderstorm, her portfolio clutched to her chest, asking if he'd consider displaying local artists. That was 2 years ago, and since then, she'd transformed not just his walls but his entire life. Earth to Jackson. Carter's voice broke through his reverie. His oldest friend and regular patron sat at the bar, nursing a whiskey neat. "You're doing that thing again where you stare at her paintings like they're going to start talking back." Jackson tossed the cleaning rag over his shoulder. "Just appreciating the view. You know, before Isabel, this place looked like every other dive bar in the city." Yeah, Carter rolled his eyes, but his expression turned serious. "Speaking of your better half, have you noticed anything different lately?" The question hit a nerve Jackson had been trying to ignore. "What do you mean?" "Come on, man. 3 nights this week she's cancelled your plans because of this mysterious new project. And that photographer friend of hers. Nate?" Jackson's jaw tightened involuntarily. "He's just helping with her portfolio." Carter leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the empty bar. "All I'm saying is, last night I saw them at the Blue Room. Pretty late for a business meeting." Jackson's hand froze mid-polish on a wine glass. The Blue Room was their place, his and Isabel's. They'd had their first real date there, claimed the corner booth as theirs. She'd never mentioned going there with Nate. "They're collaborating on a series," Jackson said, but the words felt hollow. "Isabel said it could be her big break." "Sure," Carter nodded, unconvinced. "And all those late-night phone calls she steps outside to take. The way she guards her phone like it contains state secrets. That's all about the art too." Before Jackson could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Isabel: "Sorry, baby. Have to rain check on dinner tonight. Nate found this amazing lighting setup we need to test. Don't wait up." Something cold settled in Jackson's stomach. He'd been ignoring the signs, making excuses. The missed dates. The mysterious meetings. The way she'd changed her phone's password last month. But seeing Nate's name again, knowing they'd be alone together tonight. "You know what the worst part is?" Jackson finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last week, I found a receipt in her studio. The Blue Room, 2 glasses of champagne, 11 p.m. The night she told me she was too sick to meet my sister." Carter set down his glass with a gentle clink. "What are you going to do?" Jackson stared at the painting again, the one of the thunderstorm, of new beginnings. But now all he could see were the shadows, the dark spaces between the light. "I think it's time I find out what kind of project is really keeping my girlfriend up at night." The front door chimed, and a group of regulars walked in, their laughter a stark contrast to the heaviness in Jackson's chest. He straightened up, plastered on his bartender's smile, but his mind was already mapping out his plans for the evening. If Isabel was testing lighting with Nate tonight, he knew exactly where they'd be, her favorite studio space in the old warehouse district. As he began pouring drinks, Jackson caught his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The man staring back at him looked different somehow, harder, more determined. Tonight, he decided, the truth would come out, one way or another. He just hoped he was strong enough to handle whatever he found. The warehouse district felt different at night. Jackson's footsteps echoed off brick walls as steam rose from manholes, creating ghostly shapes in the amber glow of street lamps. Each step toward Isabel's studio space felt heavier than the last, weighted by the knowledge that whatever he found tonight would change everything. He'd left Carter in charge of the bar, ignoring his friend's offer to come along. Some truths needed to be faced alone. The converted warehouse that housed Isabel's studio loomed ahead, its industrial windows casting squares of light into the darkness. Jackson knew the building well, he'd helped her move in, spent countless evenings watching her work, believing in her dreams as if they were his own. Now, those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life. As he approached the building's side entrance, music drifted down from the third floor. Isabel always painted to jazz, except this wasn't jazz. This was something slower, more intimate. His hand trembled slightly as he entered his key code, 0722, her birthday. The door clicked open. The elevator was broken, as usual. Jackson took the stairs slowly, each step measured, giving himself time to prepare. But nothing could have prepared him for what he heard as he reached her floor: laughter, Isabel's distinctive laugh mingling with a deeper voice he recognized all too well. The studio door was cracked open, spilling warm light into the hallway. Jackson moved closer, his heart pounding so hard he feared they might hear it. Through the gap, he could see canvases arranged in a circle, track lighting creating dramatic shadows. In the center stood Isabel's latest piece, the one she'd been so secretive about. The painting stopped him cold. It showed two figures intertwined, their forms abstract yet unmistakably intimate. The style was different from anything she'd done before, raw and passionate. And there, in the corner, was her signature alongside another, Nate Morrison. "The gallery owner is going to love this series," Nate's voice drifted out. "It's your best work, Is. You're finally letting yourself be free." Jackson pushed the door open wider, needing to see, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. The scene before him burned into his memory, Isabel in Nate's arms, her head tilted back as he kissed her neck, their bodies echoing the painting behind them. What about Jackson? Nate murmured against her skin. Isabel's response shattered whatever was left of Jackson's heart. "Jackson's safe, comfortable. But with you, I feel alive. I love them both, in different ways." "Is that so wrong?" The sound that escaped Jackson's throat wasn't quite a laugh, wasn't quite a sob. Both Isabel and Nate spun toward the door, their expressions shifting from shock to guilt to something else, something that looked terrifyingly like pity. "Jackson," Isabel stepped forward, her face flushed. "This isn't. I mean, I was going to tell you." "When?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. "After the gallery show. After you'd used my bar to launch your career. After how many nights of lying to my face?" Nate moved to stand beside Isabel, his hand settling possessively on her waist. "Maybe we should all talk about this like adults." Something snapped inside Jackson. Years of supporting Isabel, of believing in her, of building a life around her art and her dreams, it all crystallized into a single, clarifying moment of rage. He strode to the nearest wall and grabbed the edge of one of her paintings, one that had hung in his bar for months. "Jackson, don't." Isabel's voice held real fear now. The canvas came off the wall with a satisfying rip. "You want to talk like adults? Let's talk about how long you've been planning this. Let's talk about all those nights I waited up, worried about you, while you were here with him. Let's talk about how you used me as your safety net while you built this, whatever this is." "It's not like that," Isabel was crying now. "The art, what Nate and I create together, it's different. But what you and I have is real too." Jackson looked at the painting in his hands, a piece she'd done of his bar on a busy night, customers' faces blurred into warm colors, the whole scene glowing with life and possibility. With deliberate calm, he tore it in half. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly silent studio. "No," he said quietly. "What we had was real. This is just another piece of art you're willing to destroy for your next big break." He turned to leave, then stopped. Without looking back, he spoke one last time: "I want every piece of your work out of my bar by tomorrow night." After that, they go in the dumpster. And Isabel? The code to the building? It's not my birthday. The walk back to his car was a blur. The city sounds felt distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. It wasn't until he was sitting behind the wheel that he realized he was still clutching the torn pieces of the painting. His phone buzzed, Isabel's face lighting up the screen. 7 years of memories flashed through his mind, her smile the first time he'd kissed her, the way she'd dance while cleaning brushes, how she'd always smell of turpentine and jasmine. With trembling fingers, he blocked her number. The drive back to the corner pocket took twice as long as usual, every street holding some memory he'd now have to rewrite. But as he parked behind his bar, his space, his dream, something shifted in his chest. The pain was still there, raw and burning, but underneath it was something else, a determination he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, he'd take down her art. Tomorrow, he'd reclaim his walls, his space, his life. But tonight he needed a drink in his own bar, surrounded by the regulars who'd become family, in the one place that had been his before it had ever been theirs. The morning after felt surreal, like waking up in a familiar room where all the furniture had been shifted slightly left. Jackson stood in the corner pocket's empty dining room, staring at the bare walls where Isabel's paintings had hung. The nail holes looked like tiny wounds against the exposed brick, each one a reminder of what he'd lost, or perhaps what he'd never really had. Carter had helped him take down the artwork before opening, working in silence that said more than words could. Now the paintings sat in neat stacks by the back door, wrapped in brown paper like secrets waiting to be buried. Jackson couldn't bring himself to look at them directly, but their presence pressed against his consciousness like a bruise he couldn't stop touching. "You know what's strange?" he said to Carter, who was methodically arranging chairs. "I keep thinking about the first painting she ever hung here. Remember that one? The sunset over the city skyline. She said it represented possibility, all those lit windows, all those lives intersecting. Now I wonder if she was already planning her exit strategy, marking her territory until something better came along." Carter paused, chair balanced in his hands. "Don't do that to yourself, man. Don't let her rewrite your whole history." But the memories kept coming, each one taking on new meaning through the lens of betrayal. The late-night studio sessions that had seemed so dedicated now felt suspect. The way she'd introduced Nate at that gallery opening 6 months ago, her hand lingering just a moment too long on his arm. All the signs had been there, written in neon, while Jackson had chosen to read by candlelight. His phone buzzed, another message from Isabel. He'd unblocked her number in the cold light of morning, more out of practical necessity than forgiveness. The preview showed just enough. "Please, we need to talk. What we have is too special to throw." Jackson turned the phone face down without reading the rest. Special. The word felt hollow now, like so many others she'd used. Love. Trust. Forever. They were just colors on her palette, mixed and applied to create whatever effect she desired. The bar's front door chimed, and Jackson's heart stuttered before he remembered they weren't open yet. But it wasn't Isabel, it was Rachel, his sister, still in her hospital scrubs from the night shift. "Carter called me," she said simply, dropping her bag and wrapping Jackson in a hug that smelled of antiseptic and coffee. "I'm so sorry, little brother." Jackson let himself lean into her embrace for a moment, feeling like a kid again, back when Rachel's hugs could fix anything from scraped knees to broken hearts. But this wasn't a scraped knee, and he wasn't that kid anymore. "I keep thinking about Dad," he said quietly as Rachel released him. "Remember how he used to say you can't build a life on somebody else's dreams? I thought I was different. Thought supporting Isabel's art meant I was building something too. Pretty stupid, huh?" Rachel's face hardened. The only stupid thing was her throwing away someone who loved her enough to believe in her dreams. "That's rare, Jackson. That's precious. And she didn't just lose your love, she lost the right to it." Her words hit something raw inside him, some truth he'd been circling but afraid to face. He walked to the bar, running his hands along the worn wood that had witnessed countless stories of love and loss. His own story was just one more, etched into these walls like the initials couples carved when they thought no one was looking. You want to know the worst part? He traced a water ring left on the bar top. I actually thought about forgiving her. Last night, lying awake, I caught myself making excuses for her. Maybe if I'd been more understanding about her art. Maybe if I'd seen how special her connection with Nate was. How messed up is that? It's not messed up, Carter joined them, his voice gentle. It's who you are, Jackson. You see the best in people. That's why this place works, you make everyone feel like they belong here. But sometimes. He gestured to the empty walls, sometimes you need to protect your own space. Jackson looked around his bar, really looked at it for the first time since last night. Without Isabel's art, it felt naked, unfinished. But it also felt lighter somehow. Like a canvas waiting for a new story. I got a call this morning, he said slowly. That journalist who did the piece on up-and-coming bars last year? Apparently, he's working on a story about betrayal in the art world. Looking for people willing to talk about their experiences. Rachel and Carter exchanged glances. Are you going to do it? Rachel asked carefully. Jackson walked to one of the bare walls, touching a nail hole lightly. I don't know. Part of me wants to protect her, even now. Isn't that ridiculous? But another part. He turned back to face them, something shifting in his expression. Another part of me thinks maybe it's time to stop being just the canvas for other people's art. The morning light was streaming through the windows now, creating patterns on the floor where Isabel's paintings used to cast shadows. Jackson watched the dust motes dancing in the beams, thinking about possibilities and fresh starts. His phone buzzed again. This time, when he turned it over, it wasn't Isabel. It was an email from the journalist, following up. The cursor blinked at him, waiting for a response that would change everything, again. You know what Dad also used to say. Rachel's voice was soft but sure. He said sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing your ground, it's choosing new ground to stand on. Jackson looked at his sister, then at Carter, then at his phone. Outside, the city was waking up, another day beginning. In a few hours, the corner pocket would open its doors, and people would notice the bare walls, ask questions, share theories. But for now, in this moment, Jackson felt something unexpected stirring in his chest, not healing, not yet, but the first quiet whisper of what healing might feel like. The truth, when it finally emerged, didn't arrive with the dramatic flourish Jackson might have expected. Instead, it came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, tucked into the folds of a local arts magazine that someone had left on his bar. He almost missed it, a small article in the corner of page 17, announcing upcoming exhibitions. But there it was, in crisp black and white, rising star Isabel Chen's controversial intimacy series sells for record prices at private auction. Collaborative works with photographer Nathan Morrison showcase raw emotion through mixed media, incorporating salvaged materials from urban spaces. Jackson's hands trembled as he read further, recognition dawning with each word. The salvaged materials were his memories, the pieces of his life she'd torn down and repurposed. The paintings he'd removed from his walls, the ones she'd never collected, they weren't forgotten. They were transformed, woven into her new narrative with Nate, their history reduced to texture and background for their artistic vision. You need to see this, Carter said quietly, sliding his phone across the bar. On the screen was an art gallery's website, displaying familiar images now labeled with staggering prices. The painting of his bar, the one that had hung above his favorite booth for 2 years, was now titled Transition Space No. 4, and priced at more than he'd made in the past 3 years. She didn't just take my trust, Jackson said, his voice hollow. She took our story and sold it to the highest bidder. The realization settled into his bones like winter cold, the kind that makes you question every warm memory of summer. All those nights he'd watched her paint, believing he was witnessing something pure and beautiful, she'd been cataloging their life together as raw material for her real masterpiece, her escape. He poured himself a whiskey, not his usual practice during business hours, but some moments demanded exception. The liquid caught the afternoon light, amber and honest in its simple purpose. Unlike art, unlike love, whiskey never pretended to be anything other than what it was. "I should have known," he said, more to himself than to Carter. "Remember how she always said art was about transformation? I thought she meant transforming emotion into beauty. Turns out she meant transforming trust into profit." But as the initial shock faded, something unexpected took its place. Not anger, he'd exhausted that in the first days after finding her with Nate. Not even hurt, though that still lingered beneath everything like a bass note in a sad song. No, what he felt was something closer to clarity. He walked the length of his bar, touching each empty space where her art had hung. The walls weren't just bare, they were waiting. Like a pause between heartbeats, like the moment before dawn, they held possibility. His phone buzzed with a text from the journalist he'd been avoiding, story deadline approaching. Your perspective could add important context. Some serious allegations about unethical practices in the local art scene emerging. Jackson stared at the message, thinking about transformation. About how Isabel had taught him that art was about taking the ordinary and revealing its hidden truth. Maybe it was time to create something of his own, not with paint or canvas, but with truth and consequence. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cursor blinked, patient and non-judgmental, waiting for his story to begin. Not the story of a victim, but of someone who had loved deeply, trusted completely, and was now choosing to stand in his own truth. The corner pocket was never just a bar, he typed. It was a canvas where I painted my dreams, one day at a time. Until someone I trusted saw those dreams not as something to share, but as something to sell. The words came easier after that, flowing like whiskey into waiting glasses. He wrote about love and betrayal, yes, but more than that, he wrote about the cost of treating people's lives as raw material for art. About the fine line between inspiration and exploitation. About the moment you realize that being someone's muse means being consumed by their vision rather than seeing for your own. Carter read over his shoulder, silent until the final paragraph. You sure about this? Once it's out there. Jackson saved the document, feeling the weight of his decision settle into place like the last piece of a puzzle you didn't know you were solving. You know what I realized? She might have sold our story, but she doesn't own it. Those paintings on gallery walls, they're not just about her artistic journey. They're about every person who's ever had their trust turned into someone else's stepping stone. He looked around his bar, at the regulars who'd become family, at the spaces waiting to tell new stories, at the life he'd built long before Isabel painted her first stroke on his walls. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, creating patterns that needed no interpretation, no artistic vision to be beautiful. Besides, he added, reaching for his phone to call the journalist back, maybe it's time for a different kind of art. The kind that tells the truth about what happens when someone mistakes your heart for their canvas. The phone rang once, twice. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, momentarily dimming the bar. But Jackson stood straighter, feeling not the weight of betrayal but the lightness of choosing his own path forward. Sometimes, he was learning, the most powerful art comes not from what you create, but from what you choose to reveal. The article changed everything, though not in the way Jackson had expected. As he sat in his office above the corner pocket, reading the final draft the journalist had sent for review, he realized this wasn't just about exposing Isabel's betrayal, it was about reclaiming his own narrative, one careful word at a time. The piece was scheduled to run in tomorrow's edition, but Jackson found himself focusing less on what it would do to Isabel's reputation, more on what the process of telling his story had done for him. Each revelation he'd shared had been like removing a layer of old paint, revealing the authentic surface beneath. You've got visitors, Carter's voice crackled through the intercom. Think you'll want to handle this personally. Jackson didn't need to ask who it was. He'd been expecting this visit since he'd received a frantic voicemail from Isabel's gallery representative yesterday. The heavy footsteps on the stairs told him Nate had come too, always the loyal collaborator. He took a moment before opening his office door, remembering what his father used to say about moments of confrontation: it's not about winning or losing, son. It's about standing firmly in your own truth. Isabel looked different, smaller somehow, without her usual artistic confidence. Nate stood slightly behind her, his photographer's instinct to document rather than participate evident in his stance. You can't publish that article, Isabel said without preamble. It'll ruin everything we've built. Jackson leaned against his desk, noting how she still said "we," still viewing their relationship through the lens of her art career. You mean everything you've built using my life as your raw material? It wasn't like that. She stepped forward, her voice taking on that passionate tone she used when discussing her artistic vision. Those paintings, they were about transformation, about the evolution of love and trust. You were my inspiration. Inspiration? Jackson's laugh held no bitterness, only a quiet recognition. No, Isabel. I was your inventory. Every moment we shared, every dream I trusted you with, you were just collecting material for your next big breakthrough. Nate shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, art is complicated. Sometimes the lines between life and creation get blurred. The lines? Jackson opened his laptop, turning it to show them his bank statement. You mean like the line between inspiration and theft? Because I'm looking at the gallery's payment for Transition Space Number 4, the painting that hung in my bar for 2 years, that you two sold without my knowledge or consent. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken justifications. Jackson watched Isabel's face, remembering how he used to find endless fascination in her expressions. Now he saw something else, the careful calculation behind her every gesture. I'll split the proceeds, she offered finally. It's only fair. And we can work something out about future sales. That's not why I'm publishing the article. Jackson moved to the window overlooking his bar below. The afternoon crowd was starting to filter in, each person carrying their own stories, their own truths. I'm doing it because somewhere out there, someone else is being turned into art without their consent. Someone else is having their trust transformed into someone else's success story. He turned back to face them. But mostly, I'm doing it because my story deserves to be told as more than just background texture in your masterpiece. Isabel's composure cracked slightly. We could countersue, you know. For defamation, for interference with business relationships. You could, Jackson nodded. But then we'd have to discuss the ownership rights of artwork created under false pretenses. About the legal implications of selling pieces that were effectively stolen from my premises. About fraud and misrepresentation. The words hung in the air, not as threats but as simple truths. Jackson watched as understanding dawned in Isabel's eyes, not just of the legal precariousness of her position, but of the fundamental shift in power between them. What do you want? She asked finally, her voice small. Jackson walked to his office wall where a single frame hung, not artwork, but his first business license for the corner pocket. I want you to understand something. This bar. It's not just a setting for your artistic journey. It's my canvas. My creation. And I'm done letting someone else paint over my dreams. He opened his office door, a clear dismissal. The article runs tomorrow. Not because I want to hurt you, but because some stories need to be told untranslated, unfiltered through someone else's artistic vision. As they left, Jackson heard Nate muttering about lawyers and injunctions. But Isabel was silent, and in that silence, Jackson recognized something he hadn't expected: respect. Not the kind that came from being someone's muse or supporter, but the kind that came from standing firmly in one's own truth. Later that evening, as he worked behind the bar, a young artist came in carrying a portfolio. Jackson recognized the hope in her eyes, the dream of finding a space to showcase her work. 6 months ago, he might have turned her away, the wound still too fresh. But now. "Tell me about your art," he said, pouring her a coffee. "But first, tell me about your story." Because sometimes, he was learning, the most powerful galleries aren't the ones that hang art on their walls, but the ones that create space for authentic voices to be heard. 6 months after the article ran, Jackson stood in the middle of his transformed bar, surrounded by the quiet hum of anticipation. The corner pocket's grand reopening was an hour away, and the walls told a different story now, not just his story, but a collective narrative of creativity and resilience. The morning's newspaper lay folded on the bar, its headlines confirming what he'd already heard through industry circles: Isabel's gallery had cancelled her upcoming show, citing artistic differences. The photographs of her leaving the gallery, Nate notably absent, might have once stirred something in Jackson's heart. Now they were just images on paper, as distant as memories of last summer's rain. He ran his hand along the bar's freshly refinished surface, remembering the day he'd decided to renovate. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about creating space for what came next. The old wood had been stripped, sanded, and restored, its grain now more beautiful for having weathered time and change. "You ready for this?" Carter asked, adjusting the lighting over a series of black and white photographs. They were part of the bar's new rotating exhibition program, a platform for emerging artists who shared their stories alongside their work. "You know what's strange?" Jackson replied, straightening a frame. "I kept thinking this moment would feel like some kind of victory. But it's quieter than that. More like finding your way home after a long detour." Rachel finished, walking in with an armful of programs for the evening's event. She'd been his strongest advocate through everything, not by fighting his battles, but by reminding him of who he was beyond a story of betrayal. The programs she carried announced the bar's new identity, the Corner Pocket Gallery, where every story finds its canvas. It was more than a tagline, it was a promise to himself and to every artist who would share this space. Here, creativity would never be a weapon or a means of exploitation. It would be a bridge between souls, transparent in its intentions, honest in its execution. Jackson thought about the young artists whose work now adorned his walls. Each piece came with a story, not hidden in subtext or wrapped in artistic mystification, but shared openly as part of the experience. There was James, the former accountant whose urban landscapes captured the dignity of everyday moments. Maria, whose series on family bonds spoke to both loss and reconciliation. Each had trusted him with their vision, and in return, he'd created a space where art and integrity could coexist. The article that had exposed Isabel's practices had done more than just affect her career, it had sparked a larger conversation in the art community about ethics, authenticity, and the true cost of creation. But Jackson had learned that real change rarely comes from exposure alone. It comes from offering alternatives, from showing that there's another way to nurture creativity without compromising one's soul. He'd kept one small reminder of Isabel, not on the walls, but in his office. The torn halves of that first painting she'd ever hung, now framed separately, served not as a monument to betrayal but as a testament to reconstruction. Between them hung a simple statement: every ending is raw material for a new beginning. The first guests would arrive soon, critics, artists, loyal patrons who'd supported him through the transformation. But as Jackson looked around his space, he realized the most important audience was already here, the person he'd become through all of this. Not a victim seeking justice, not an entrepreneur seeking revenge, but someone who'd learned to stand firmly in his own light while creating space for others to shine. A young artist nervously entered early, clutching a portfolio to her chest. The scene echoed that day 2 years ago when Isabel had first walked in, but everything was different now. Jackson saw not just the art she carried, but the story in her eyes, the dream seeking honest ground to grow. "Welcome to the Corner Pocket," he said, extending his hand. "Tell me about your vision." As the evening light filtered through the windows, casting warm patterns across the walls, Jackson felt something settle inside him, a quiet certainty that transcended the chaos of betrayal and the temptation of revenge. He had built something here that was bigger than his own story. He had created a space where authenticity wasn't just valued, but vital. The bar would open soon, filling with voices and stories, dreams and possibilities. But for now, in this moment of anticipation, Jackson simply stood in his truth, not as someone who had been betrayed, but as someone who had found his way back to himself, one careful choice at a time. He picked up a glass, holding it to the light. The amber liquid caught the sun, creating patterns as complex and beautiful as any painting. This was his art now, not frozen on canvas, but living in moments of connection, in spaces of trust rebuilt, in the courage to remain open after loss. The door chimed. The first guests were arriving. Jackson smiled, ready to begin again.